Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Before Canada was the nation we know today, its future was anything but certain. In fact, there were multiple points in history where Canada stood on the brink of becoming part of the United States. These weren't minor skirmishes or political rumors. They were full-blown invasions, secret negotiations, and powerful movements driven by ideology, economics, and survival. Imagine British redcoats marching across snow-covered terrain while American revolutionaries pushed northward, convinced that Canadians would join their cause. Picture maps redrawn behind closed doors, territories debated in smoky rooms, treaties signed that changed everything, or preserved just enough. This isn't just about borders on a map. It's about identity, power, and the incredibly fragile nature of history. Canada didn't become what it is by accident. It resisted pressure, overcame invasions, and made hard choices that could have gone another way. So buckle up, because what you're about to discover isn't the Canada you were taught in school. It's a story of close calls, shifting loyalties, and the very real question: what if Canada had become American? In the 18th century, North America was a battleground, not just of soldiers, but of empires. Britain and France were locked in a fierce contest for control of the continent, each laying claim to vast stretches of land, each forging alliances with indigenous nations, and each investing in forts, settlements, and trade networks. Canada, known then as part of New France, was at the heart of this struggle. Its geography, commanding the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and interior trade routes, made it a strategic prize. The French built a deep-rooted society in Canada, complete with farming communities, Catholic missions, and a thriving fur trade fueled by indigenous partnerships. But in 1763, everything changed. The Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War and handed control of Canada to the British. For Britain, this was a major victory, giving them a foothold in the heart of North America and control of a region critical to imperial trade and defense. But victory came with tension. The French. Population now lived under British rule, and indigenous alliances had been disrupted. This uneasy balance would be shaken just a decade later by the American Revolution. When the 13 colonies declared independence from Britain in 1776, the effects rippled far beyond the immediate conflict zones. In British North America, what we now call Canada, the Revolution wasn't just a distant war, it was an existential threat. The American revolutionaries, driven by Enlightenment ideals and resentment toward British rule, believed that they could spark a continental rebellion. They assumed French-speaking Canadians, who had recently been conquered by Britain in 1763, would seize the chance to throw off British control and join a new American republic. But that didn't happen. The Americans launched an invasion in 1775, marching into Quebec in the dead of winter. It was a bold gamble, but it failed. The local French-Canadian population, though culturally and linguistically distinct from the British, did not rise up. There was mistrust toward the Americans, and many had actually found a degree of religious and cultural tolerance under British rule, especially after the Quebec Act of 1774, which had granted Catholics legal rights and recognized French civil law. That fragile peace held, and the American campaign collapsed. However, the failed invasion revealed just how unstable the situation truly was. The Revolution shook the confidence of the British Crown in its ability to hold the Canadian territories. And then came a massive demographic shift. Over 40,000 loyalists, colonists who had remained loyal to Britain, fled the new United States and resettled in Canada, primarily in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and what would later become Ontario. These newcomers brought with them a strong sense of British identity, political expectations, and a desire for land and security. For Britain, the loss of the 13 colonies was a wake-up call. Canada now became the center of British hopes in North America. It wasn't just a territory to be managed. It was a symbol of imperial resilience. Britain doubled down on building infrastructure, military outposts, and governance systems. It saw Canada as both a refuge for loyal imperial subjects and a buffer against the revolutionary and later expansionist ideals of the United States. This marked a turning point in Canadian identity. It wasn't yet a nation, but it was beginning to be shaped in contrast to the American Republic. The Revolution made clear that Canada's path would be different, more gradual, more loyal to the Crown, and more defined by a patchwork of cultures and interests. Yet beneath that surface was an ever-present tension. How long could Canada remain safe from the pressures of American ideology, ambition, and proximity? That question would continue to haunt Canada's leaders for generations. During the early stages of the American Revolution, George Washington and the Continental Congress saw Canada, then called Quebec, not just as a strategic prize, but as a potential ally. The logic was straightforward. The French Canadians, conquered just over a decade earlier in 1763, might resent British rule and seize the opportunity to join a broader uprising for liberty. Washington believed that if the Americans could take Quebec quickly, they'd open a northern front against Britain and gain legitimacy by uniting more colonies under the revolutionary banner. So in late 1775, two American armies launched a bold and dangerous invasion. One force, under General Richard Montgomery, moved north from New York, capturing Montreal with relative ease. The second, led by Benedict Arnold, trekked through the unforgiving Maine wilderness in a harrowing winter march that cost lives and supplies. The two forces met near Quebec City in December 1775, preparing for a surprise assault on the fortified city. The Battle of Quebec, fought on the snowy morning of December 31st, was a disaster for the Americans. Montgomery was killed, Arnold was wounded, and the remaining forces were driven back by a combination of determined British defenders and harsh winter conditions. The siege that followed dragged on, but with dwindling supplies, disease, and no reinforcements, the Americans eventually retreated entirely in the spring of 1776. But perhaps even more striking than the military failure was the political one. The French-speaking population of Quebec did not rise up in support of the revolutionaries. Why? There were a few reasons. First, the Quebec Act of 1774 had granted them the right to maintain their Catholic religion, their French civil law, and many of their cultural practices under British rule. While many Anglo-American colonists saw this as favoritism, French Canadians viewed it as a guarantee of protection and identity. The American revolutionaries, mostly Protestant and English-speaking, didn't exactly present a welcoming alternative. Second, the American invaders were foreign and, in many cases, deeply mistrusted. There was no grassroots revolutionary movement in Quebec, no widespread desire for republicanism. French-Canadian leaders were cautious, and the Catholic clergy generally urged loyalty to the crown, fearing that American rule might bring religious persecution. Finally, for many residents, the war felt distant from their day-to-day concerns. Supporting either side posed enormous risks, and neutrality or passive acceptance of British rule seemed the safer path. This moment, the failed American invasion of Quebec in 1775, marked a profound turning point in North American history. Its failure didn't just close the door on Canada becoming the 14th colony of the American Revolution, it crystallized a unique Canadian identity long before the term Canada meant a unified nation. For Britain, this failure served as a wake-up call. The Americans had come dangerously close to prying Quebec from their grasp. In response, the British doubled down on their investment in Canada, not just militarily, but politically. They reinforced their presence in the region, but also strategically began cultivating loyalty among French Canadians. The Quebec Act of 1774, which had already extended significant cultural and religious protections to the French-speaking population, now became even more important. Britain saw that it could maintain control not by suppressing French identity, but by accommodating it, thus setting the foundation for Canada's enduring French-English duality. For the Americans, the lesson was humbling. The revolution wasn't contagious. They had assumed that all peoples under British rule would yearn for the same kind of republican freedom they sought. But Quebec disproved that. The French-speaking Canadians recently conquered chose stability and cultural preservation over the uncertainty of war and ideological alignment. This rejection highlighted the limits of American revolutionary ideals when transplanted into culturally distinct regions. It was a sobering moment that underscored the complexity of colonial identity and allegiance. And for the Canadians, even though they weren't yet called that, the experience was foundational. By not joining the revolution, Quebec's inhabitants made a choice that would shape their future. They preserved their language, their legal systems, and their religion, all within the framework of the British Empire. This wasn't blind loyalty. It was a calculated decision based on survival, cultural preservation, and mistrust of foreign powers. It also planted the seeds of a third way. Not quite British, not quite American, but something else. A colony defined not by rebellion or complete assimilation, but by negotiation, pragmatism, and identity preservation. That sense of in-betweenness would echo throughout Canada's later history, especially in its approach to governance, federalism, and multiculturalism. So while the failed invasion was a military footnote for some, its consequences were massive. It clarified the boundaries of revolution, entrenched French-Canadian loyalty to the British Crown, and helped lay the groundwork for a Canadian identity that was neither wholly imperial nor wholly revolutionary, but something unique, complex, and still evolving. The War of 1812 was the United States' second and arguably most serious attempt to take Canada. American leaders believed the time was ripe. Britain was bogged down in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and the U.S. framed the invasion as a liberation, expecting Canadians, especially in Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario, to greet them as fellow Democrats eager to shake off British rule. But that assumption collapsed almost immediately. In the summer of 1812, American forces invaded Canada in multiple locations, including near Detroit and at Queenston Heights. The Isidore Canadians, along with British troops and crucial Indigenous allies, pushed back fiercely. At Queenston Heights, Major General Isaac Brock became a national hero after leading a bold counterattack. Though he died in battle, his defense galvanized support across the colony. Meanwhile, Tecumseh, the powerful Shawnee chief, played a critical role in resisting the Americans and uniting Indigenous nations in defense of their territories, seeing the U.S. expansion as an existential threat. The war revealed something surprising to both sides. Canadians didn't want to be liberated. Many in Upper Canada were recent American immigrants themselves, but even they resisted the invasion. Why? Because life under British rule offered stability, land, and, ironically, a degree of autonomy that was attractive, especially compared to the chaos of war and partisan strife in the U.S. The war also awakened a sense of Canadian nationalism. Though Canada was still a collection of colonies, the shared experience of resisting invasion forged a common identity among English, French, and even some Indigenous groups. Farmers became soldiers. Loyalists defended their homes. French Canadians, despite past tensions with the British, fought to protect their way of life. The defense of Canada became a unifying cause. In the aftermath of the war, officially ending in 1815 with no territorial changes, Canada emerged more confident, more aware of its distinct path, and more committed to self-preservation. Monuments were built. Heroes like Brock and Tecumseh were lionized. And though the term Canadian was still evolving, the war gave the people of British North America a taste of what it meant to stand together, against a common foe, for a shared homeland. In short, the War of 1812 wasn't just a failed U.S. invasion. It was a defining moment in the forging of a Canadian identity, rooted in defense, pragmatism, and a growing sense that this land would not be easily taken, nor its people easily swayed. The 19th century saw the rise of manifest destiny in the United States, a powerful and pervasive ideology that fueled American expansionism. Manifest destiny was the belief that the U.S. was divinely ordained to expand across the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This ideology pushed the U.S. government and its citizens to look northward with increasing interest in annexing Canada. The American public, particularly in the wake of the War of 1812, viewed Canada not just as a neighboring colony but as a prize waiting to be claimed. This notion of expansion was deeply ingrained in American politics and culture, especially as the U.S. rapidly acquired vast territories through war, treaties, and settler colonization. By the 1840s, many Americans believed it was inevitable that Canada would eventually join the Union, one way or another. Meanwhile, in Canada, the growing fear of U.S. expansion loomed large. The country was already surrounded by American territory to the south and west, and Americans were eyeing the region with interest. Canada was still a loose collection of British colonies, and many of the residents feared that their independence could be jeopardized if Britain did not take a stronger stance to protect them. Adding fuel to this anxiety were the Fenian Raids. In the 1860s and 1870s, Irish-American militias, driven by resentment toward British rule, especially because of the ongoing Irish struggle for independence, launched a series of raids into Canada. The Fenians believed that by attacking British-held Canada, they could force Britain to withdraw from Ireland. These raids, although unsuccessful and often poorly organized, contributed to the perception in Canada that the U.S. government or its citizens might someday launch a more serious attempt at annexation or invasion. For Canada, these raids were a wake-up call. Despite being defended by the British Empire, Canada began to see the vulnerability of its position. As Manifest Destiny was espoused more openly, and as the U.S. continued to expand westward, it became increasingly clear to Canadian leaders that their safety depended not just on Britain's might, but on their own ability to stand united and defend their land. This period of rising anxiety about U.S. expansionism truly catalyzed the movement toward Confederation. The idea that the British colonies in North America could band together to create a stronger, unified political entity was gaining traction. While Confederation wasn't solely about defense, the threat of U.S. annexation undeniably played a major role in motivating the discussions. The fear of American territorial ambitions, coupled with the vulnerability felt by the British colonies in the face of potential invasions, led many to see the formation of a united Canada as not just a political necessity but a survival strategy. As the U.S. expanded westward and espoused the ideology of Manifest Destiny, many in Canada recognized that the American appetite for land would not easily be satisfied by the newly formed U.S. states alone. The threat was both territorial and cultural. Americans viewed Canada as a natural extension of the U.S., and with each victory in expanding the country's borders, the idea of absorbing Canada became more appealing. The Fenian Raids, though largely unsuccessful, also highlighted the vulnerability of the colonies, particularly in the face of transnational groups seeking to weaken British rule. The fear of annexation sparked a deeper dialogue about what it meant to be Canadian. If the colonies stayed divided and vulnerable, they could potentially be picked off by a more powerful neighbor. But if they united, they would stand a better chance of defending themselves, not just militarily, but also politically. The idea of a self-governing nation began to resonate with more people, as they saw that it wasn't just about separating from Britain, but about taking control of their own destiny. Confederation became more than a political arrangement. It became a collective strategy for preserving Canadian identity, autonomy, and the ability to withstand external pressures. The unification of provinces such as Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia created a framework that could handle both domestic and international challenges, including the threat from the U.S. By coming together, Canada could present a united front to the outside world, particularly to the increasingly powerful U.S. The process of confederation was thus shaped by fear, but also by a growing recognition that unity could foster strength and resilience. The desire for security against a larger neighbor, along with the cultural need to preserve both British and French identities, drove the political compromise toward confederation, paving the way for the creation of Canada as a nation. By the late 19th century, Canada found itself at a crossroads. The country was caught between the loyalty to Britain, its colonial heritage, and growing pressures to define its own national identity amidst a rapidly expanding United States. The year 1867 marked a pivotal moment in Canadian history with the passage of the British North America Act, which officially established Canada as a dominion within the British Empire. This move was not just a political shift, it was a declaration of autonomy, albeit within the context of the British Empire. However, the looming American presence cast a shadow over Canada's future. The purchase of Alaska by the U.S. in 1867, just after Canada's Confederation, was a clear signal of American ambitions to expand further into the Northwest. The purchase effectively extended U.S. territory to the edge of the Canadian border, intensifying concerns about the potential for further U.S. expansion into Canada, particularly into the rich natural resources of the North. U.S.-Canada border. Disputes also simmered throughout this period. While the Oregon boundary dispute, settled in 1846, had established the 49th parallel as the boundary between the U.S. and Canada on the West Coast, tensions were far from resolved. The controversial slogan, 54-40 or fight, represented the American push for more territory in the Pacific Northwest. Though this conflict didn't escalate into war, it illustrated the U.S.'s growing territorial ambitions. The specter of further disputes lingered, particularly as both countries eyed the resources and the strategic value of territories like British Columbia and the Arctic regions. Despite the rising tensions with the United States, Canada's loyalty to Britain remained a central element of its identity. In the face of manifest destiny and the expansionist ideologies in the U.S., Canada's leaders chose to align with the British Empire rather than seek union with the United States. The bond with Britain was not only about military support, but also about the shared cultural and legal frameworks that define the Canadian political landscape. The British monarchy's influence, the parliamentary system of governance, and the legal systems in Canada helped to preserve a distinct Canadian identity that was rooted in British traditions. At the same time, this loyalty wasn't without its complications. Some Canadians had begun to question whether their future lay with Britain or as part of an independent nation in North America. The Confederation process itself was in part a response to the fear of U.S. expansionism, yet the choice to maintain a connection with Britain was seen by many as a safeguard, an alliance that provided political stability and military protection. In essence, Canada's identity was forged through diplomatic negotiation and the balancing of competing interests. The desire to maintain loyalty to Britain and retain a cultural connection while simultaneously securing its independence from the United States. The decision to remain loyal to Britain helped Canada carve out a unique national identity that allowed it to weather American pressures without sacrificing its autonomy. This relationship would continue to shape Canada's foreign policy and national character in the years to come. In choosing Britain over union with the U.S., Canada's leaders prioritized sovereignty and cultural preservation, laying the groundwork for the evolution of a truly distinct Canadian identity, one that emphasized independence while also maintaining strong ties to the British Empire. This decision, however, would continue to be tested as Canada slowly moved toward full political independence over the course of the 20th century. As we look back on Canada's path to becoming the nation it is today, it's tempting to ask, what if? What if Canada had joined the United States instead of maintaining its identity as a separate nation? How might the country's economic, cultural, and political landscape have evolved differently? Economic implications. Had Canada joined the U.S., it's likely that its economic development would have been more closely integrated with that of its southern neighbor. The economic powerhouse of the U.S. would have provided Canadian resources a faster route to American markets. Industrial development might have been accelerated, especially in the resource-rich regions like Alberta and British Columbia, as the country would have been part of a larger unified market. Canada's natural resources, such as timber, oil, and minerals, might have been exploited more rapidly, aligning with the U.S. economic system. However, Canada's economy might also have taken a different shape. Cultural values of independence and balance between provinces might have shifted in a more centralized American direction. Canada's current model of provincial autonomy might have been weakened, as the U.S. system tends to favor a federal government that holds considerable power over the states. Cultural identity. Culturally, the question arises, could Canada have preserved its French-speaking identity and British heritage in the face of the dominant Anglo-American culture? Quebec's French roots may have been at risk of being submerged into a broader American cultural melting pot, given the historical tendency of the U.S. to assimilate minority cultures into its dominant Anglo-Saxon model. The French language, which remains a cornerstone of Canadian identity today, might have been marginalized, just as Indigenous cultures faced increasing pressures to conform to American norms. Moreover, Canada's bilingual and multicultural policy, which continues to be a defining feature, might not have emerged in the same way under American influence. With the U.S. long focused on Americanization, Canada's cultural diversity might have struggled to thrive, and the policies that celebrate a mosaic of identities could have been replaced by a more uniform vision of national identity. Political differences. Politically, the impact of joining the U.S. would have been profound. Canada's system of parliamentary democracy may have evolved differently within the U.S. federal structure, possibly losing its British parliamentary traditions. Would Canada have been able to maintain its constitutional monarchy, or would it have adopted an American-style republican system? Perhaps the Canadian Senate would have mirrored the U.S. Senate, weakening provincial representation in favor of a stronger centralized government. Furthermore, Canada's neutrality in certain global conflicts and its strong tradition of peacekeeping might have been more aligned with U.S. policies in international affairs. The U.S. Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and involvement in World Wars I and II could have drawn Canada into a more aggressive military role, changing how Canada is perceived globally, potentially altering its role in organizations like the United Nations or even NATO. Interviews or reenactments. To dive deeper into this speculative history, we could hear from historians or experts discussing the potential changes in economic policy, political systems, and cultural outcomes if Canada had joined the U.S. Their reflections could include insights on the role of French Canadians and whether they would have fought for cultural rights within the U.S. system, how Indigenous nations might have fared under a unified American regime, given the history of U.S. policies toward Native peoples, how Canada's approach to healthcare, education, and social programs might have diverged from the U.S. model. Reenactments could explore the conflicting loyalties between the British Empire and the growing calls for self-governance that characterized Canada's pre-Confederation era. They might also show how Canadian nationalists might have resisted American expansion and the unique path that would have unfolded if Canada had been absorbed into the U.S. The enduring question, in the end, the question what if, may never have a definitive answer, but it is a thought-provoking exercise. Would Canada have lost its distinct identity and joined the melting pot of American culture? Would it have risen to become an economic giant, much like its southern neighbor? Or would it have struggled to maintain its uniqueness in the face of overpowering cultural and political forces? The truth is, by staying loyal to Britain and choosing its own path, Canada preserved its identity and culture, ultimately becoming the multicultural bilingual nation we recognize today. But the what-ifs of history, if Canada had gone down a different path, remain a fascinating exploration of the country's complex and resilient identity. Conclusion and legacy. The near misses, the threats of annexation, and the pressures of becoming part of the U.S. didn't just shape Canada's past, they helped solidify its independence in ways that are still felt today. These moments of uncertainty forced Canadians to define what they wanted their nation to be, steering them toward confederation and an increasingly distinct identity. In the face of American expansionism, Canada's commitment to British ties and its own system of governance gradually laid the groundwork for what we know today as Canadian sovereignty. Resilience, compromise, and a distinct sense of nationhood emerged from these challenges, forming the bedrock of Canada's evolution into the peaceful, diverse, and strong country we recognize now. From the War of 1812 to the Manifest Destiny, fears and even economic and political differences with the U.S., the idea of a united Canada and its relationship with America took shape through a series of trials that reinforced its separation and independence. But even as Canada chose its own path, U.S.-Canada relations evolved from a history of tension into one of peaceful cooperation, forming one of the world's strongest cross-border partnerships today. As we look back, we realize that these near misses weren't just close calls, they were the crucial moments that helped Canada carve out a unique identity and future. The lessons of these events aren't just historical curiosities, they are part of the DNA of Canada's national consciousness. Call to action. If you enjoyed this dive into what could have been, hit like, subscribe, and tell us, should Canada and the U.S. ever have united? Your thoughts could help shape the conversation around Canada's past and its future. Let us know what you think in the comments.